Good evening and welcome to Novara Live. Coming up tonight, cars and homes have been firebombed as anti-immigrant violence erupts in Belfast. The US has launched multiple strikes on Iran in response to the downing of an Apache helicopter, and we speak to the mother of a Palestine Action activist who was herself held in solitary confinement for 5 days under the Terror Act. My name is Stephen Methven, and tonight I am joined by the Novara Media final boss, Aaron Bastani.
The M. Bison for the geriatric millennials who played Street Fighter 2 as kids. Very good to be talking to you, Stephen.
We're going to talk about Belfast in detail in a little while, but I just wanted to get your take on what it's like to see, twice in 1 week, these kinds of scenes of racially motivated violence on our streets.
Well, it's becoming more frequent, isn't it? I think that's indisputable. The words that come to mind for this are political cannibalism. When you have people setting fire to buildings in their own neighborhoods, which, by the way, include a range of people of ages and racial backgrounds, that doesn't help solve the problem. It just makes it worse. And inevitably, when you have the uncorking of mass political violence without organization, nobody ever benefits. Nobody has ever benefited. What it means is more repression, more failure, and more inability to solve problems. Whatever you think those problems are, housing, you think immigration is too high, access to certain public services, jobs, whatever you think it is, that political cannibalism just makes society eat itself. You can't address the issues. You can't provide solutions. So very, very sad. And I don't just say that as some kind of emotive default response. Oh, it's all very sad, isn't it? It is very sad because it means, I think, if it carries on, we will not actually get over these issues and things just get worse.
No, I think it's completely tragic. I think you're totally right. Real tragedy to see that kind of violence, aggression, anger, but misguided anger, misdirected or deliberately directed by other people in such dangerous directions. Very sad. Anti-immigrant violence has convulsed the city of Belfast. On Tuesday night, 100-strong crowds, including masked men, marched in the streets of the city, with gangs going house to house to break down the doors of immigrants' homes, sometimes dragging them out into the street, an act described by the perpetrators as liberation. Cars and homes were also firebombed, with protesters blocking roads in the city and even checking cars, according to some reports. In some cases, entire families were burned out of their homes, with rescue workers helping people escape the flames, including, in this case, a family with children. For some reason, buses were also set ablaze as the terrifying violence spun out of control. Elsewhere, there were street fights, while wheelie bins were set on fire to act as burning roadblocks, preventing traffic from entering or leaving targeted areas. This morning, residents awoke to smoking streets, cars and houses with the doors and windows of those houses stoved in, and people's belongings strewn across the street. Local resident Anselm Shima expressed his fears to Reuters.
There are people who are not from Northern Ireland. And as myself living here, I'm afraid maybe I might be the next to be attacked on the street. So I don't know where to take my family, my children, who is 9 years old, who is asking me every question that crosses his mind, and I don't know how to answer him. I don't know. Maybe I'm the next. I was not able to take my son to school because I don't know how, if we'll be able to reach the school. So we are locked in the house with my wife and my 3 children. We don't know how to come out.
By all accounts, it was a terrifying night for many residents, whether immigrants or not. And several areas were affected around East Belfast, including Shankill Road and Crumlin Road. There were also more muted protests in other parts of Northern Ireland, including Antrim, Bangor and Ballymena. The violence erupted after 30-year-old Sudanese man Hadi Alodid is alleged to have tried to murder Stephen Ogilvie on the street of Belfast on Monday using a kitchen knife. Video of the attack appears to show Alodid repeatedly stabbing and slashing at Ogilvie's head, face and neck before bystanders forced him off the victim, with one repeatedly hitting Alodid with a hurling stick. Alodid appeared in magistrate's court today, charged with attempted murder, threatening to kill an NHS radiographer earlier in the day, and possession of a knife. It was in court the prosecution revealed that Ogilvie lost his eye in the attack and suffered severe damage to another eye. Ogilvie's family have now come forward with their own views on the attack, as well as last night's violence, saying this: "We are completely devastated by the horrific attack on our loved one on Kinnaird Avenue. This has been a massive shock to our whole family, and right now, our only priority is being at his bedside and helping him recover. We want to say a profound thank you to the local people who bravely stepped in during the attack. Your quick actions absolutely saved his life, and we will never forget what you did for him in that moment. We also want to thank the emergency services and the doctors and nurses looking after him." We are aware of the tensions and talk of protests following this incident. We want to make it absolutely clear that overnight unrest is not welcome, and peaceful protest is the only way forward. We have many migrants who make a deeply valuable contribution to our country, including in our healthcare system and hospitality sector, and we depend on them to make our country work. We do not want this terrible tragedy to be used to divide people or fuel hostility. In response to last night's violence, Northern Ireland Police have increased their presence on the streets today. We're joined now by journalist Amanda Ferguson, who is in Belfast. Amanda, welcome to the show.
Thank you.
I'm here with Aaron Bastani, who's going to ask you a couple of questions as well in a bit. Let me begin, though, by asking you, how have things felt in Belfast today in the wake of these terrible scenes of violence last night?
I personally felt particularly sad today because it's horrific to see the violence that's unfolded on the streets. Obviously, everybody's thoughts are with the injured man from Monday night, but what we saw overnight in Belfast and in pockets of Northern Ireland has been absolutely horrific, and there is no legitimate concern, as it's being described, that justifies burning people out of their houses or setting public transport on fire that's being used by the community, and making people live in fear for their lives purely based on the color of their skin. Like there's no way to call it out for anything other than racism whenever you're seeing what's happening. It's been talking to people is very sad. Like, talking to the gentleman that was featured in your clip earlier on, like he was talking to me about how his neighbours, he's been living there for 10 years. Some of his neighbours came in to check on him this morning to make sure that he was okay. But like that man's poor children were like absolutely frightened beyond anything in their own home, and they should be safe there, And I think one of the saddening things for a lot of people, and this violence and this racism is definitely not representative of the vast majority of people in Northern Ireland, whether they're Unionists or Republicans or however they choose to identify, is that they're just horrified at what they're seeing online, and they know that there are online and real world agitators in England and in the US, and some of them are quite famous, and I don't even want to mention their names at the minute. But this is something that's being fueled by people taking advantage of a horrific incident. They're separate incidents. Such a horrific incident happened in North Belfast on Monday night, and then there has been horrific wanton violence. And I think that the SDLP leader, Claire Hanna, put it well whenever she said it's a race-based pogrom. We've heard from political leaders from across the political spectrum. We've heard from the Secretary of State today. We've heard from the Prime Minister today, all lining up in condemnation. And the police are sending out clear messaging and a very clear presence on the streets of Belfast. Armoured Land Rovers aren't anything new to this part of the world, but you're seeing more of them in the heightened sort of security setting over the last few days, and armoured police cars and soft skin police cars, whatever, loads of police presence. And the fact that the Chief Constable John Boucher has had to call for mutual aid just shows that police are on call around the clock to try to respond to these sort of things. And it's a pretty depressing times and pretty sickening. And it's now spilling over into kids having to be let out of school early, workers having to leave their jobs early, public transport being cancelled, people's lives being ruined. So there's a multiple layers to this of people that are aggrieved. But honestly, my heart goes out most to the man who was injured on Monday night, and also to the families who are terrified that they're going to be targeted next just for being themselves, just for having skin that isn't white. Mm-hmm.
Now, when you watch the footage here, it can look like this was very, very widespread violence in Belfast. I mean, was it? And if it wasn't, what can you tell us about the areas where it did take place?
No, it wasn't widespread. There are people in the leafy suburbs who won't have been impacted too much by it at all. This is happening, and this is destroying facilities within working class communities. The people that are going to be arrested in the days to come are not the people online who are cheerleading for racist violence to take place. They're sitting in their comfortable homes, not worrying about any of this. It happens whenever there is violence in Northern Ireland. I often get calls from people asking me, is this a return to the Troubles and so on. But racism exists in other parts of the UK and Ireland. Rioting exists in Dublin, in London, in Cardiff, in Scotland as well. It's not unique to Northern Ireland. It's obviously depressing whenever it's happening in the part of the world that you actually live in. But, we've seen the last 3 summers, there has been a racist flavour to rioting that exists in different parts of Northern Ireland. But, the idea that the whole province, the whole country, the whole region, jurisdiction, however you want to call the North or Northern Ireland is, on fire isn't necessarily the case. But it is pretty damaging. And on top of the layers of people who are impacted by it, you have the tourism chiefs, I'm sure, pulling their hair out. The business community has released a joint statement calling for this to stop. We've heard from trade unions. We've heard from a whole range of people, which just shows that what's happening isn't representative of anywhere near a majority of people. And, you have the online warriors criticising journalists. You have journalists on the ground being intimidated. And, the people who are trying to take advantage of a horrific incident that happened on Monday need to be called out for exactly what they are, and it's racist, pure and simple.
Yeah, I have a few questions, but I guess I'll start with this one, Amanda, which is we've seen public disorder, violence, rioting across the UK, particularly since 2024. Has something in Northern Ireland in particular changed in the last 2 years? Because you've had civil disturbances there and elsewhere, of course, most memorably in England in 2011. But has something changed with, I don't know, with shifting sands of political culture, changes in the media, changes with the government of Westminster? Are there different things at play in the last 24 months?
Oh, yeah. Whenever anything happens in Northern Ireland, it's never just one neat reason. There's always about a dozen things that are going on. We know that the influence of online actors has become an issue. We know that there are far-right agitators that exist on both jurisdictions on the island of Ireland as well as in Britain. The issue around immigration is a separate issue from what we're seeing happening on the streets. There's no justification for what we are seeing. If you have legitimate concerns, peacefully protest, which is some people have done. But the idea that Northern Ireland has a particular problem just doesn't bear out with the facts. It's the least ethnically diverse part of the UK and Ireland. The number of asylum seekers, I think, in Northern Ireland is under 3,000. And the way some people talk, you would think it was a lot more than that. But also, something that really troubles people is that people from Ireland, whether they're from the north or south, historically have made their homes all over the world for hundreds and hundreds of years. And that's either been because of famine, because of conflict, because of economic opportunity. They may have fallen in love with someone else from another country, or it might just even be for the better weather because it rains nonstop in this part of the world. So it's the idea that, there's an Irish pub in every country, that American presidents claim Irish heritage. There's a reason that happens, but people don't seem to connect that. So when other people are coming here to make their homes here, whether it's as refugees and asylum seekers, or whether it's just for a job that they want to move to another place, that's a legitimate thing to happen. And we know in the years ahead that there's going to be more movement of people because of conflict, because of climate change, and all the rest of it. And some people don't seem to be able to piece it together. And I will be honest with you, the amount of abuse that I've received online, physical threats, sexual assault threats, a lot of people who don't seem to be particularly smart, they may not even be humans, they could just be bots, talking all sorts of nonsense online. And the amount of misinformation that floats around all the related issues on this topic is just unreal. Some people think that people who are fleeing countries, because of persecution or because of war, are getting some sort of cushy life in a really fancy hotel, and they don't realize that people aren't allowed to work and so on. And I think that the impact of Brexit is another issue as well, because the nature of migration has changed. I think as well that It's been whenever migration tended to come from Europe, it was easier for people who weren't exactly the same as everybody else that lives here to blend in. Whereas because the migration has changed, it's very obvious whenever someone is from another country, and it's appalling to think that the people who are working in our hospitals, working in our universities, working in hospitality, enriching lives here are being targeted because they don't have white skin. And, I hosted a kids' politics conference last year, and it was a young child from Ukraine who said to me, why are we made to feel welcome, but like our friends aren't made to feel welcome that are coming from other countries? And like, it's we heart, as we face, like, was really sad whenever I explained to them that it was to do with racism. And that is what this is about. People are being burned out of their houses because they have a different color skin. And like that, there's no other way to describe that other than racism. You can't dress up you being worried about immigration, or you're worried about jobs or housing or poverty. They're all issues to have as part of the democratic process, and people have elected reps to do that. But, in Northern Ireland, our local politicians aren't in charge of immigration policy. Like, nobody who was out on the streets last night is coming up with other policy ideas. They're being seen to be saying really horrific racist things, and people are coming out with masks over their face, and we're being told by people on the ground that they can see that older men are directing younger men in what to do, and that's very sinister, and something that is probably going to be explored a little more in the time ahead. But I am hopeful. I travel in hope over experience that hopefully there isn't any more violence. Maybe it'll fizzle out tonight. Who knows? It may last another couple of days. But I think this is going to recur. It's going to happen again because, as I said, every summer for the last 3 summers, this has happened, and it's just depressing for most people, because most people, are welcoming to anyone that wants to become a local. Anybody that wants to make their home here is given a welcome by people, and people don't care what country they're coming from or what color their skin is. If they're dead on, if they're good people, then that's okay. And you can't, as the Justice Minister said this morning, you can't demonize a whole group of people on the behaviour of an individual or of individuals, because we have seen in Northern Ireland in the past how that works out.
One more thing. I mean, what you said there in terms of what's changed, you're talking about changing the media environment. Of course, Elon Musk has bought X. You have a very belligerent administration in the White House, very happy to talk about this stuff in the international media, again, not least on social media. Yeah. But I suppose the one thing we can sort of control is politicians in this country. So people like Rupert Lowe, Nigel Farage, others too, are they playing a role in sort of fanning this? I'm not suggesting they're doing that on purpose, but is that also a big variable that wasn't necessarily there 3-4 years ago? Leaders of parties with a big media spotlight talking about this stuff and to some extent, cheering it on, if we're being honest.
It may be a focus for some people. I think that some people were wondering who Rupert Lowe was, wondering if he'd ever been to North Belfast. The same applies with Nigel Farage. Most people don't think that these people care about Northern Ireland, that their interest is based in some sort of serious concern or legitimate concern. And I'm sick of hearing that phrase about legitimate concerns. It's okay to have a view on government policy and so on, but it's not okay to be overtly racist to people just because they look different from you. And something I have said in the last couple of days about the influence of people online and the influence of people who don't live here and don't know the places, that all of a sudden you get all these experts that couldn't find North Belfast if you handed them a map to it, may never have been here at all, or just sort of like fly in and out and have been here for a few political engagements. It's appalling to think that people would try to make capital of a really horrific set of circumstances, because what we saw on Monday night was horrific. Everybody's thoughts are with the victim of a brutal, violent attack, and the justice system needs to take its course and be allowed to do so. But whenever you're driving around and you're seeing black plumes of smoke coming up over your city, when you're seeing buses being burned out, when you're seeing people looking frightened, in their day-to-day lives, not wondering how they're going to get home from work and so on. Like it was like a ghost town in Belfast city centre today. After I was finishing court, I went to Belfast City Hall for the First Minister's press conference, where she revealed that the new mayor of Belfast, Mayor Donnelly, is a 30-year-old woman who has been in office for a week. And she issued a statement at the start of the week saying that her priorities were going to be women and girls and also the Irish language, because she's a Gaeilgeoir, she's a fluent Irish speaker. And the police have come to that young woman last night and told her that she's under threat. And one of the reasons that seems to be given for why that has happened is because in her welcome, I'm going to be mayor statement, she mentioned the words diversity and inclusion. That's insane, like.
Totally. Amanda Ferguson, I mean, we know you have to go. We've kept you a bit longer than we said, but thank you very much for joining us tonight.
No worries. Thank you for putting up with me. And I'm very tired at the minute, so I'm a little bit grumpy. But whenever you see what's happening in your own city, there's a reason to be grumpy. So
yeah, of course. Thanks very much.
Thank you.
Right, let's hear a little bit more from some of Belfast residents affected by the violence. Jamie Corrie, who had his house burned in the violence, leaving him homeless, has lived on the targeted street for 13 years.
But to see out there, we stand there and watch your own property getting burnt out, I'll never get over that feeling, mate. Never get over that feeling. Like, I was actually standing right there watching my whole house just go up slowly but surely. And that was it. There's literally nothing I could have done about it. I told them and all when they were lighting the car on fire, that's my property where our car is. And they still didn't care. They were like, oh, it'll be safe. I knew straight away it wasn't going to be safe. The car was actually like that, parked on the side of the footpath. That's that close to my house. Basically like that. And that's when I went up. You know what I mean? It's people that's angry, lashing out. You understand why, you know what I mean? One of their own people is basically being butchered in the middle of a street. Like, when have you ever heard in Northern Ireland somebody trying to get beheaded? Do you know what I mean? You never hear that. You hear shootings, you hear beatings, you hear car accidents, you hear burglaries. You never hear someone getting beheaded in basically broad daylight. And like I say, there's kids in our North Belfast community that probably witnessed that or traumatised of seeing what's happened. But I can't blame people for lashing out. But then again, starting trouble on this wee tiny street, like there's two people from the old community who's lost their property.
Reverend Brian Anderson is superintendent of the East Belfast Mission. He told Reuters about the memories last night's violence stirred.
I saw, particularly in these two streets, just violence upon violence. I could use the word anarchy. It took us back certainly to times in the Troubles, where just for a short period of time before security forces and police and fire services came in, just cars been turned over, picked on, smashed, then set alight, cheers gone up, and then it spreads in streets like this to what you see here with these houses, just awful. Well, we were defined as either a Protestant community or just down the road there's a peace wall and there's a Catholic community. But now with a variety of people coming from different countries and with different coloured skins, it's redefining the community, and that causes a little bit of uncertainty, and people are trying to work out what that means. But I do believe this: it's not a zero-sum game. It's not an either-or game. It's how do we work as a community to live together, thrive together, and develop a community that is multicultural. There are issues around housing. There are issues around employment. There are pressures whereby this community who would expected to got a house in this community now aren't. So there are issues to be dealt with, and we need our politicians to step in and help that debate. But we cannot do it with violence. It just takes us back to the old days, and we don't want to go back there.
Yara Novrotska is a Ukrainian teenage refugee living in Belfast with her mother. She told Reuters what she experienced last night.
Well, after the riots, I think my neighbor's house was set on fire. So my front door caught the fire a bit, and it had to be kind of kicked out to kind of stop the fire, because it was about to go in the house. Yeah, I mean, it was terrifying, I was with my dog at the house, so I had to escape through the back door. Whenever my dog, my neighbor's dog was trapped in the house, so they were also trying to break into their house to get the dog. Yeah, but I was lucky enough that my friends live nearby, so they let me like crash for the night. Yeah, I mean, I assume because like it's a street where like lots of immigrants live, you know. Yeah, and like I assume like yeah, people aren't really friendly for like specific like ethnic groups. I mean, obviously, like, it's terrifying because like there are like so many people living on the streets, you know, and they have to be like forced to like leave their houses to live somewhere else, you know. So yeah, obviously it's terrifying. Yeah, so I'm just like gathered some essentials that I need for like a few like first few days, you know. So I just like yeah, so I'm just gonna like kind of like put it in my friend's house and like come back to help my mom to kind of like get other stuff from the house as well. So yeah, well, hopefully it's going to be like resolved as soon as possible, but you know, you never know.
Now, the Times spoke with 2 Ugandan carers in Belfast, and they reported this. The women had watched on as crowds began to descend at 6 p.m. last night and started setting fire to bins outside, followed by cars and finally houses on their streets. It was so terrifying, said Sumaya Nakazibwe, 35, who came to the UK 3 years ago and is studying for a diploma in adult health while working full-time as a care assistant. She fainted from fear after seeing petrol bombs thrown at neighbors' homes, with thick black smoke wafting into her house before the windows were smashed in. I wasn't feeling well because I couldn't believe my eyes. She and her housemate Stella Ariakot, 30, a carer and master's student, are now homeless. Having previously thought of Belfast as a very peaceful place, Nakazibwe said she was considering returning home. She urged those rioting to remember that the person they are targeting is actually looking after their mother or their granny. Meanwhile, I left my mother back home. Aaron, we have there, testimony from a care worker who says, you know what, this makes me want to go back home. This makes me want to abandon the valuable job that I'm doing in Belfast that nobody else is doing. I'm going to go home. We have, the head of the Belfast mission saying, look, the violence is inexcusable, but there are political pressures, political failures that haven't addressed certain pressures in the community.
Yeah.
And not mentioning migration as one of them, but shortages of housing, for example. And then we have the man who was left homeless, despite understanding the anger that people are feeling.
Yeah.
How do we make sense of this kind of collage of events that flow out of the scenes of violence? People leaving, people being triggered about the past, political failure, and anger that people do in fact feel.
Yeah, we talked about this on the show last night. I think anger is entirely justified. If I lived in a neighborhood and my friends or my neighbors' kids saw a guy being, beheaded or somebody trying to behead them in broad daylight on the street, I'd be angry. I'd be angry for a number of reasons. And I think that's a very normal thing to feel. And that gentleman, I think his name was Jamie Corrie, said he understood that anger, but he's saying, why on earth are you setting fire to people's houses? Arson with intent to endanger human life is a potential life sentence, a very, very serious crime. Each of those buses, by the way, that we saw being set alight, very expensive bits of kit, at least £500,000. Whatever your views on this, even if you want zero immigration into Northern Ireland, how on earth is setting houses on fire and destroying public property, which literally belongs to you? Young kids, especially poorer young kids, are going to be dependent on buses to get to school, to college, to work, to watch the football, to get to the shops, anything. It's there for you. It's subsidised for you. You own it. They're destroying it. So I don't for the life of me understand why anybody would make excuses for any of that. The housing angles are really important. And you've seen really a profusion of HMOs in this part of the world, not just for immigrants or refugees, but overwhelmingly for people in Northern Ireland, as you see across the whole of the UK. The right only talk about HMOs when it's refugees, but in the last 15 years, HMOs have exploded in this country. I have an HMO both sides of where I live. In Portsmouth, they are everywhere. At least in Portsmouth, it's licensed. In places like Bolton, they aren't licensed at all. You can just build them. So these pressures absolutely exist. Finally, the police. I think everybody knew last night was going to happen. And yet you had that gentleman saying that for a moment there was quote unquote anarchy because the police, the emergency services weren't there. Why weren't they there? How is it possible that when the original incident happens, that the people that stop it, I know a police officer comes in at the end, but the people that stop it are regular members of the public, one with a bit of sports equipment, saving a person's life. And so I think the average punter, whether it's in Northern Ireland, England, Wales, Scotland, they're seeing the same thing, which is a state that fails to protect, whether it's on policing, whether it's on migration, and people are going to have different views on all of this, right? You might agree with one bit, disagree with another bit, but on policing, immigration, housing, you have a state that isn't protecting people, isn't ensuring their best interests. And you can come at that with a range of perspectives and solutions, but that's the abiding sense of it all. And that's the challenge for politicians now. How do we get a policy platform and a politics which feels protective, that makes people feel safe, and it's actually putting them first? Nobody feels like the state and politics is putting them first anymore.
Yeah, it's very true. It's almost like there's an exercise in some kind of state building is required in order to make people, feel like the state works for them. Otherwise, it's always going to be outsiders who get blamed. It's always like the natural move of people who, in fact, don't want to build a state, really, to blame outsiders so that they can continue to sort of profit from the degradation of all our lives. That's a very, very common pattern.
Can I give you one example?
Yeah.
So I had a Polish friend of mine. They're a Polish leftist. But they said, I recently got my passport renewed and it basically cost them nothing. And it was very quick. And they said, people like to moan about the Law and Justice Party, but with stuff like this, they were very good. And so, it's hard for people. There are so many contact points with the state. How many of them really work, right? If half of them work, if your passport is cheap and it comes along really quickly, say, wow, that worked really well. I'm so happy. People don't have that experience of the state in this country. Now, that might seem like a little thing, a passport or a piece of graffiti or fly tipping or whatever, but it's additive. And then on top of that, you put the big things like housing, rule of law, immigration, etc. It's a huge challenge. We're going to talk about Andy Burnham in the days and weeks ahead, but this is the zeitgeist that Andy Burnham now has to get on top of. And if he doesn't, then the Labour Party, frankly, is toast.
Yeah. Let's go to some of the political reactions to those events that we've seen today. This was Northern Ireland's First Minister, Michelle O'Neill.
The scenes that we all saw last night were nothing short of disgraceful. Families fleeing their homes as masked men set fire to their houses. Their possessions, their cars, everything they owned, decimated. The video this morning of children being led from their home under protection of police in red gear, carrying nothing but a teddy bear, genuinely broke my heart to watch as a mother and as a grandmother, and I'm sure yours too. Hard-working businesses, some of which just opened their doors after being targeted last year, again set fire to. None of this is about community. Not one single bit of it. There's nothing community-orientated about terrorising innocent and defenceless families who are fearing for their lives. It is thuggery, plain and simple. The attack in North Belfast was heinous and it was absolutely wrong. But what we're now witnessing is that attack being exploited by dangerous and reckless people to target innocent people who had absolutely nothing to do with it. People who are simply trying to live here, work here, and raise their families here. Racism is wrong, intimidation is wrong, and violence is wrong. There can be no excuse or no justification for what we witnessed last night. I have been and remain in constant contact with representatives on the ground, supporting people, with the PSNI Chief Constable, with the British Prime Minister this morning, with the Secretary of State, and with everyone that we need to speak with. And I will continue to do everything that I can to support local communities through this horrific period.
Keir Starmer also made a statement in Prime Minister's questions this morning.
The acts of violence and arson that followed are totally unjustified. This morning I spoke with the First Minister, the Deputy First Minister and the Chief Constable. And the Secretary of State for Northern Ireland is meeting leaders in Belfast today. We are united in calling for calm and determined to restore order, support the police and all those on the front line, and ensure that justice is done.
Now, yesterday it was revealed that the alleged perpetrator, Hadi Aladid, had made his way from Sudan to Dublin before taking a bus across the open border into the north of Ireland. There, the UK Home Office, then run by the Tories, granted him leave to remain in 2023. That has, of course, now been used to score political points by some of Britain's right-wing parties. On Tuesday, Restore Britain leader Rupert Lowe posted this. The Sudanese man arrested for the attempted beheading was granted leave to remain in the UK by the Home Office, led by now Reform MPs Braverman and Jenrick, on the 28th of September 2023. On the 26th of October 2023, 1 month later, Jenrick formally answered a parliamentary question with the following statements. The UK has a proud history of supporting refugees. The UK is proud to have welcomed Sudanese nationals. We also welcome eligible Sudanese nationals through our refugee family reunion route. This is what Reform's Shadow Chancellor has said about welcoming unvetted Sudanese fighting-age men. It is scandalous. I want to know exactly what Jenrick and Braverman knew about these Sudanese men when they were allowing them to stay in Britain. What checks were made, criminal records, anything. They were welcoming young men from a brutally backward country that has an entirely alien culture, completely incompatible with our way of life. Why let them in? Why do it? Why endanger British men and women? How many more did they let in? I'm putting a number of formal questions, freedom of information requests to the Home Office to obtain that information. Jenrick and Braverman were responsible for our borders. They held the power. They let this man in and then handed him a visa. It is sickening, a disgraceful failure that must never be forgotten. Lowe sort of expanded on that theme today, posting this. I want people finally held to account for what has been done to our country, civil servants, judges, politicians. If they have knowingly placed unvetted, dangerous, third world savages in our communities, near our children, then the Restore Britain government will aim to prosecute them. If that includes Reform's Robert Jenrick and Suella Braverman, then so be it. When they held the power, they welcomed that Sudanese monster into our country and handed him a visa. An attempted beheading followed their decision. Those responsible must be held to account. And I want to send a very clear message to officials planning to place more of these men in communities across Britain, near schools, nurseries, families. When Restore Britain wins the next election, we will pursue you with the full power of the state. That will apply retrospectively. If those in power are made to feel the consequences of their decisions, the quality of those decisions will improve. We are so far past half measures now. The country is too far gone. Britain needs a democratic revolution. That is exactly what Restore Britain is going to do. I mean, you have to wonder, like, prosecute them under what law exactly? I mean, I guess that will be part of the Restore manifesto at the next general election. Now, some have pointed at agitators in America as being in part responsible for last night's violence, including ex-owner Elon Musk. He posted his approval of Lowe's prosecution, saying, quote, "This is the way." But in the hours before the violence, he also posted this to his 240 million followers. Only by protesting repeatedly and loudly will there be change, he wrote, while reposting a tweet from Stephen Yaxley-Lennon, aka Tommy Robinson, calling for the whole of the UK to hit the street in the wake of the, quote, "yet another invader attack. It's time," he said. And those graphics, especially the one on the right, ordering Belfast businesses to close in certain areas, were circulating amongst others calling for young men over 18 to come out, masked up and ready to fight. So that graphic that Elon Musk has put out there is very, very close to linked to graphics circulating on Twitter ahead of that violence. Indeed, Musk posted that ahead of the violence, as well as other graphics, basically calling up, young fighters to come out and beat people up. Now, it's likely that it's that kind of intervention that's led Ofcom to write to social media companies, warning them that it has, quote, already launched investigations into several platforms, arguing that they appear to have been used to incite last night's violence, and reminding the platforms of their duty to, quote, assess and mitigate the risks of illegal activity occurring on their sites and apps under 2023's Online Safety Act. Aaron, at the beginning of the show, you talked about uncorking the bottle. I wrote a question down, which is the genie truly out of the bottle now when it comes to race-based violence in this country?
Well, 100%. And it's only going to be made worse by the presence of people like Elon Musk so prominently. He wants to fund political parties in this country. I think there's a really terrific argument to shut down X. I mean, I don't think I'd go there just yet. But a story alongside this is, in the last 48 hours, but particularly yesterday and the day before, every third image on X was Nigel Farage chasing Andrew Bailey on BBC Question Time. These were fake AI-generated images. One was Farage with a gun. And you just think, what crazy world are we now in, where the world's first trillionaire, which is what Musk is going to become, owns a platform. He has 250 million followers, and every third image is a politician whose party is polling first, chasing the governor of the Bank of England with a gun. And I presume this was advertising a crypto scam or something. We don't have to do this. We don't have to do this. It's clearly having an impact on the quality of conversations in this country. I don't want to do censorship. I think it's generally bad. I think X is a great net good over the last 15 years. It certainly has been for me. Novara Media probably wouldn't exist without it. But now you're crossing a line where I think Elon Musk was getting very, very close to incitement there personally. And when he has absolutely no grasp of the facts, often when he's talking about these things, he's not in the UK. He's not that familiar with British politics. I have major, major problems with it. But I would also say this is a real problem for reform. Because obviously if Restore makes these issues more salient, more voters go towards them over it, they're going to get, let's say 7 or 8% of Makerfield as one example of that. That might be the difference between Reform winning or losing. Reform thought they had basically sewn up the right-wing vote and they needed to tack slightly to the centre. That was why they got Suella Braverman. That's why they got Robert Jenrick. They needed to tack slightly to the centre and that would get them a majority in government. But now they're facing issues on two sides. And I think in a strange way, and you won't hear this said very often because, of course, Farage hasn't condemned what's happened so far. Leanne doesn't have, it should be said. I think in a strange way, this actually creates more problems for Reform than anyone else in the medium term. If there are now riots every 6 months in this country, and you have the party that's polling first not saying anything about them, the leader of that party not saying anything about them, then headmasters, police officers, business CEOs, senior people in the NHS, small business owners, centre-right family people are going to be really worried about this guy. Okay, so I do think it's a real challenge for Reform, actually. And there's 3 years left. It's not like there's a general election in 6 months' time. And I think Reform know that, and they're worried about it. And I think sort of what we're seeing with Restore and Makerfield is just a glimpse of the future in this regard.
You mentioned riots every 6 months. I mean, we've had two in the space of a week, right, based around issues of race and sort of, white grievance of some kind. On the Musk thing, I'm not really for censorship either, but that doesn't mean that I'm not for legal controls on media platforms, right? A newspaper can't print what it wants to a large audience in order to damage someone's reputation. You can't go on TV and break reporting restrictions in court cases or start, identifying the child victims of sexual assault in those trials. And you also can't go on TV because you're governed by Ofcom there and start, inciting people to violence. And, if we think of the media company as a broadcaster, which in some sense, it's not a broadcaster in the traditional sense of, TV images, but it certainly is broadcasting to huge audiences. Controls are surely appropriate. That's not censorship, right? That's just
no, it's not censorship. But I'm saying if you went to the extent of banning X,
sure.
Of course, there are many good people on X sharing very valuable information. I'd like to think Novara Media does that, for instance. That would obviously be unfair on them. But as a society, you have to make a cost benefit as to what this platform is doing. And I think we're starting to get to the point where you do have that conversation. That would be censorship on good voices, and it would be justified on the bad voices. In terms of the legislation and regulation of these spaces, has to happen. Any conversation about the Makerfield by-election on broadcast TV, from GB News to Sky to BBC, if you mention the by-election, if you mention one candidate, the presenter then has to read out all the candidates. They say, this by-election is on this date, it's happening here, these are the candidates. They're legally obliged to do it. And yet you see the Wild West on social media, which, by the way, includes us. We can talk about the by-election in a fundamentally different way than broadcast media can. In a way, I think that's kind of unfair, actually. If we have a clip on social media, on YouTube rather, that gets 500,000 views, and that's not regulated, but then BBC, Sky, GB News are all regulated, Channel 4 News, we probably do need that conversation. So I'm saying that from a place where actually it doesn't necessarily benefit us, but some light touch regulation on this stuff, on the platforms, YouTube, Facebook, X, Instagram, I think is long overdue. And one final point, if anything, maybe this stuff will make people take the state seriously again. The state needs to be present. The state needs to be strong. In Northern Ireland or the north of Ireland, what you see is a state that isn't strong with regards to a police presence or a state that can provide adequate housing, right? The state needs to be strong. People need to be respectful of the state. That used to be a sort of de facto socialist position until quite recently. And I feel like a Westminster government imposing the democratic will of the people, who of course have voted in that government, on people like Musk and X, I think is long overdue. We need to have political oversight of runaway finance and economic capital. We have to. That's the nature of what democracy is meant to be. Right now we're not doing it because we come out of this end of ideology slipstream, end of the Cold War, where actually politics can't invade on economic life. And it's long overdue we correct that. It has to.
Remember, it can, yeah.
It can and it has to, because if it doesn't, Stephen, we're going to lose democracy. And I don't say that lightly. We're going to lose democracy. We're going to lose the rule of law. We're going to lose a lot. I'm not just talking about like the nice things that you might associate with multiculturalism. I mean, quite basic things that are actually inherent to human flourishing. We have to take that seriously, that possibility. And that's why the state, I think, now needs to take itself seriously.
Aaron mentioned regulation of YouTube there and other platforms. Just to assure our audience, we are not completely unregulated as an organization. We're regulated by the Impress Code, and we stick to it very carefully to ensure our journalism is fair and good. I've got one last question for you, which is about Rutlo's language in those tweets about Sudanese people. He was doing exactly that thing of taking one case and saying, all Sudanese people are like this. And he was critical of the Tories for welcoming Sudanese refugees at that point, at a time where people were plausibly saying, and still ongoing, that there was a genocide occurring in Sudan.
Yeah.
What do you, I mean, for me, when I see rhetoric like that, in Germany, you would have a very hard time being a politician and using rhetoric like that for obvious reasons to do with Germany's past. Here, it's completely fine. And it sits so uneasily with me that this is like the level of kind of political discourse we have in Parliament, where entire groups by a parliamentarian can be described as, I can't remember what he said, like, vile savages or something like that. Those weren't his exact words, but he definitely used the word savages. I mean, what do you make of it?
Well, you can have a very radical critique and even offer quite radical proposals while not sort of, I wouldn't say even lapsing, going into that kind of territory, right? Someone like Peter Hitchens, he supports the death penalty. He says you have to have capital punishment in order to do X, Y, Z. Japan does it. Nobody thinks Japan is an uncivilized country, has much lower rates of crime than we do. Actually, it's very rarely used in Japan. But regardless, that would be his argument, for instance. Now, I've talked to Peter about that on Novara Media, and I've told him why I disagree. But you can make those radical arguments about the death penalty. Somebody might be saying that this man who did this awful crime should face the death penalty, or he should be deported. You can make those arguments without saying that everybody from this country is a savage, right? That is not necessary, and it's not helping your argument because it's also not true. But you are right. This is a very new thing in British politics. I suppose one way it was justified is that he was referring to comments made by Robert Jenrick 3 years ago. I mean, it is extraordinary, Stephen, that Robert Jenrick went from that guy at the dispatch box in the House of Commons. It's not a tweet. He was working on behalf of, at the time, Her Majesty's government to implement, national policy as part of his brief as a member of a government cabinet, or maybe he was a junior minister, but, he was a senior person in the last government. And in 3 years, he's gone to where he is now. It's not 25 years. It's not a Damascene conversion where, Oswald Mosley is here and then 25 years later he's here, or Enoch Powell before the Second World War is here and then by the 1960s he's here. It's 3 years. There are people watching this who have cans of beans in their cupboard from 3 years ago, right? So that journey that Jenrick's been on, I think really underscores how little he actually believes in politically. And given his role as, quote unquote, the shadow chancellor for the party that's now number one in the polls in this country, has been over hundreds of polls, that's a concern. I would say he's the biggest charlatan / opportunist we've had in politics in this country for a very long time. And he could be very powerful very soon.
It's very hard for me not to think that, in using language like that, they are in fact fanning these flames. That's the point of that language, to make it legitimate, to make it usable, and therefore to make it sort of, with language comes actions. What the more you're permitted to say, the more you're permitted to do in many cases, I think.
Yeah.
Very worrying, very worrying. You've likely seen that we're fundraising as we move into a new studio. This is a huge move for us, and we need all the backing we can get so we can reach as many people as we can before the next general election. Head to novara.media/support to join our regular donors from just £1 per month. Now, you might not think that giving £1 a month will make much difference, but having lots of small regular donations makes us resilient. Plus, being backed by our audience means that we are completely editorial independent. Aaron, can you imagine what it would be like to try to cover the topics we have today, this week, if we had to sort of please our corporate backers?
I can't, no. One of the stories to talk about tonight is the oil energy crisis in the Strait of Hormuz. Talk about that in real detail, but people aren't being told the truth. If the next 4 months are like the last 4 months, we are in for one of the major energy economic shocks of the last century, let alone my lifetime, probably worse than 73. Big if, of course. We don't have corporate media talking about that stuff in depth. You can find it on Bloomberg. You can find it in the FT if you dig really deep. We want to take these kinds of conversations, which is so important, to a mass audience. We want to move beyond the trivia and often the partisanship, which actually gets you nowhere. So I don't think we could do any of that without the model we have. It allows us certain commitments to truth and to objectivity and facts that is often missing elsewhere, in my opinion.
Yeah, you don't want to take money from people who, when you're doing your reporting, they get annoyed because it might affect their share prices or piss off their friends in high places, right? That's always the limit to billionaire-funded media.
Yeah, we saw this really with Palestine. There were some decent outlets whose coverage of various topics is rather good. I won't name names. But because of how events unfolded on October 7th, 2023, it meant their coverage of what proceeded thereafter, a genocide in Gaza, was really lackluster. And they couldn't do that because the people at the top of those organizations or who gave money to those organizations didn't want to be called anti-Semites or whatever by their friends at nice dinner parties in Manhattan or central London. We don't have that problem here at Novara Media. We call a spade a spade.
The US has resumed airstrikes on Iran. Following those strikes, Tehran has said that 20,000 people have now been left without water after US missiles hit reservoir tanks. The US says, on the other hand, its jets targeted defense and radar sites. The strikes followed the downing of a US Apache helicopter on Tuesday, with both pilots rescued by US forces. Hours later, US President Donald Trump posted this on Truth Social. I have just been informed by our great military that last night the Iranians shot down one of our highly sophisticated Apache helicopters while patrolling over the Strait of Hormuz. There were 2 pilots involved, both are safe and uninjured. Nevertheless, the United States must, of necessity, respond to this attack. Thank you for your attention to this matter. President Donald J. Trump. In response to the US strikes on the country, the government released this statement. The diplomatic process does not happen in a vacuum. To advance any negotiation or diplomatic process, you need a minimal space to be able to advance the work of diplomacy. Unfortunately, the United States is harming this process with contradictory messages, frequent changes in positions and demands, and frequent violations of the ceasefire. The Zionist regime is also harming this process with frequent violations of the ceasefire in Lebanon. That was from Iranian Foreign Ministry spokesperson. It wasn't just words, though. Iran's Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps also retaliated. They released this footage said to show missiles aimed at US bases in Jordan, Bahrain, and Kuwait. The clashes mark one of the biggest exchanges in hostilities since the two countries agreed to a ceasefire in April. And speaking at a news conference just before we went on air, Trump appeared to indicate that the latest attack will not be the last.
You posted this morning about Iran, and you said that they've taken too long to get to a deal. I want to make sure I quote you correctly. You said that now they will have to pay the price.
Yeah.
What did you mean by that specifically?
Well, we're going to be attacking them very hard.
Resuming bombing?
Yeah, well, we are. Based on the helicopter, I guess we have the right to do that. They shot down a very incredible, actually an incredible machine. And at first they said they didn't do it, then they admitted they did. It was sort of easy because we have the bomb. We actually have the bomb. We got very lucky that bomb didn't explode. That bomb was lodged in the helicopter, it didn't explode. It was on fire, but it didn't explode.
It also looks like the US may aim at further civilian infrastructure in Iran. This was from Fox News earlier today.
Now, interestingly, President Trump told me that he is getting close to ordering new strikes against Iranian power plants and bridges because he says the Iranians are tapping the United States along when it comes to the negotiating process. He says the bully of the Middle East is dead, and he told me I may keep going when I asked him about a possible response to the Iranian missile fire that targeted U.S. forces in Kuwait, Bahrain, and Jordan overnight. The president said they had a chance to sign a deal and survive, indicating again that he may order new strikes against the Iranian regime in response to their dragging their feet at the negotiating table.
Trump, of course, very much needs Iran at the negotiating table. In May, US inflation jumped to 4.2%, the third consecutive increase since the start of the Iran war. Before the war, it was at just 2.4%. That's a pretty massive leap in just a few months. That is largely, according to analysts, due to increased energy prices in the US. Despite months of negotiation, the Strait of Hormuz remains closed and under Iranian control. Over the last 2 months, fewer than 1,000 ships have passed from the Persian Gulf and into the wider world, and those ships carry millions and millions of barrels of oil. Before the war, that many would have moved through it in a week. Aaron, Trump is in real trouble domestically, right? The war is deeply, deeply unpopular. Inflation has almost doubled since it began, which is crazy, really. This is a very, very dangerous moment for him, isn't it?
More than dangerous. And I'd say the fact that the United States is looking at targeting water supplies is not an act of courage or bravery or confidence.
Sorry, they're looking at attacking electrical supplies and bridges. They're said to have attacked a water supply today.
Yeah,
Sorry.
well, so civilian infrastructure is a hallmark of weakness, not strength, fundamentally. But they don't have military targets necessarily that they can target and stop and address these challenges, right? So they're having to instead just go for stuff that they know is there. You can't move an energy plant. You can't move, a desalination plant. You know it's there, and that's why they're going for it. Whereas they don't know where lots of the launch pads, etc., which are being used for various missiles,
the drone factories.
They have no idea where these things are. And the truth is they can never know. Missiles have been launched from, for instance, Lebanon to Israel, despite all the attacks by Israel. So think about this for a moment. Who thinks you can stop it happening with Iran? This is a country that's 7 times the surface area of the whole of the UK. If you can't stop it in South Lebanon, how the hell are you going to stop it in Iran? By the way, a very mountainous country, hugely mountainous country. It's perfect terrain for underground, drone factories and missile launch sites, which can be wheeled in and out. It's simply not going to happen. They are not going to be able to stop every single drone and missile leaving Iranian territory. In fact, I think they're going to get nowhere near that. In terms of the crisis we're now in, by some measures, this is the greatest energy shock in human history. Well, certainly in industrial human history. I mean, you can go to some climate-related thing, when we were walking around as hunter-gatherers. But this is the greatest energy crisis, in modern times. In 1973, the oil crisis then saw a reduction of 4 to 5 million barrels per day. 4 to 5 million. 1979 crisis saw 5 to 6 million barrels per day. Now you're seeing a reduction of between 10 and 11 million barrels per day. So in terms of its macroeconomic role, of course, the global economy was much smaller in 1973. So you might say, well, relatively, that was a much bigger shock. True. But if we're talking purely about the number of barrels of oil being drawn from global supply on a daily basis, this is the biggest shock in history. I think the Russia-Ukraine war was about 2 million barrels per day. So like I say, 10 to 11 million. Now that could go up, right? It might go down, but it could also go up. There's a lot further it could go up. That's partly a function of the Hormuz being closed, but also, of course, these attacks on various production and refinery sites across the Gulf by Iran. So that's a huge shock. Why have we not felt the full consequences of that? Why has US inflation only gone to 4.2%, not 24%? Because we have extraordinary global strategic reserves for energy, both privately and publicly. The Chinese government has, I think, something like 9 months' supply of fuel if it needs it, but private companies hold them to. That applies for every country. Some countries are better prepared than others. India, not very well prepared. China, Japan, very well prepared because, of course, they have huge industrial production needs. Also, they don't have any domestic oil of their own. So a double reason to have those kinds of strategic reserves. But we've been going through those reserves. And according to the IEA, those reserves are now at record lows. Yep. The OECD inventories for refined oil, again, are getting towards record lows. And once we start to get towards winter, October, September, October, November, there's a serious conversation about, okay, well, do we start using less energy now and ration over winter? So you start to see a major reduction in things like planes, 3 or 4 day week in factories, etc. That is not a million miles away. That's in October, maybe, okay? And I think the Iranians have done this on purpose. I think this is very calculated on the part of the Iranians. They want to screw Trump in the midterms in November. And this is the perfect time to start doing it. So I think they've taken their time with the negotiation because they know that's a really big point of leverage for them. They know he'll want a deal before November. And if he doesn't get his act together, this could get very bad very quickly. Although I should say it's much worse for the Europeans and the Asians than it is the Americans in terms of a global energy shock, because of course we produce a lot less of it than the US does in terms of oil and gas. And the Asians in particular are really, really screwed.
But we haven't seen the same inflationary hit.
We haven't. But I suppose you might say that our economy is less energy dependent. We have more fuel efficiency with our cars. We have less industrial production. We don't have AC.
More public transport.
More public transport, yeah. I think China, for instance, it's electrified so much, probably just in the last 3 or 4 months, people purchasing new EVs and whatnot. Probably actually the net hit hasn't been too big. But America's carrying on as usual, right? You've even had a World Cup there, so it's going to burn through a ton of energy, I presume, in the next few weeks. So this is a major, major crisis, and we could see something really crazy by the end of the year. And it really speaks to the sort of studied indifference of people. I've had some people saying, Aaron, you said that oil was going to hit $200 a barrel. I mean, it's $100 a barrel, right? That's a big deal. You said it was going to hit $200 a barrel. You don't know what you're talking about. They haven't solved the problem, right? We're now eating into these global strategic reserves, and nobody really knows what happens next. And you only rarely see this in the Wall Street Journal or Bloomberg or the FT. This is a huge thing that's now coming down the line. You know, the reason why Rachel Reeves is talking about VAT off, kids going to theme parks or whatever, is they know there's a massive cost of living crisis in the next 3, 4, 5 months if we don't get on top of this.
Yeah, and you've got to remember that even if when the Strait opens up and the reserves are down, the demand on the oil coming out is going to push prices up as well, right? There's going to, there's going to be a huge demand to restock those reserves. The demand that far outstrips our normal, consumption of oil by states, for example. One thing I've noticed, I'm trying to book a holiday at the moment in July. And I won't say where to because I don't want everyone to rush to the price to the cheap flights. But I have never seen flights to this part of the world so cheap at that time of year as I'm seeing them now. And I think that's because people are really nervous about taking flights over the summer and getting stranded somewhere because there's not enough jet fuel. That's another sort of that is a larger economic hit that's going to affect loads of countries, businesses, et cetera, as well. This kind of fear of travel being stuck somewhere. I think what's so remarkable about this case with Trump as well is we all learned the word exogenous shock during the Ukraine war, right? That inflation sort of hit because there was this external shock that caused the price of energy to go up. But this is a self-inflicted exogenous shock, right? And I don't think people will forget that.
No. I mean, we were talking about the World Cup yesterday when I was hosting the show. And people have often accused the World Cup of being an opportunity for sports washing. Trump has now invented inverse sports washing. You host the World Cup so you can make your national brand even worse, which is kind of an accomplishment on his part. But I think that's the same here. The exogenous shock as a result of politics. You can talk about 73 in Israel. You can talk about, obviously, 2022, Russia, Ukraine. The geopolitics led the economic shock. But I can't think of another one like this where it's just so stupid and dumb. It's so stupid. It's so stupid. And it's going to have implications politically for the Republicans, right, for a really long time. And if this is not solved before November and they get a spanking, there will be just hundreds, thousands of people within the Republican Party itself, candidates, activists, partners and husbands and wives and kids of those people, who are angry at Donald Trump for screwing them over, just like Keir Starmer did with Labour councillors in the May elections here. Yeah. So very, very interesting. Watch this space.
On Friday, 4 Palestine Action activists will be sentenced on convictions of criminal damage. The Filton 4, Charlotte Head, Leona Kamio, Fatima Zainab Rajwani and Samuel Corner were all involved in a 2024 action at an Elbit weapons research site in Filton near Bristol, where they smashed up drones, equipment and other items. Samuel Corner will also be sentenced for grievous bodily harm, though contrary to the original charge, without intent. But for the very first time in British history, all 4 may face being sentenced as terrorists simply for damaging property. At a pre-trial hearing, the judge found a terror connection in the case, meaning that at sentencing, he will consider evidence that may allow him to sentence them for longer periods for criminal damage, also to deny them parole at the normal time, and subject them to registration with counter-terror authorities for decades. Of course, as you now know, that connection was subject to reporting restrictions, meaning neither the jury in the first trial nor in the retrial, where the 4 were convicted, were allowed to know it existed. So even while they were judging whether or not to convict them, they didn't know that they could in fact be sentenced as terrorists. Nor were they allowed to hear defenses from the defendants explaining why they had broken into the factory to smash stuff up. The 4 who were convicted last month were also remanded to custody ahead of sentencing, which in the case of the 3 women who'd been bailed after their first trial was described by some as a kind of extrajudicial punishment. The Filton 6, and indeed all the rest of the Filton 25 who've been arrested and charged, many of whom were held in prison without bail for well over a year before they see a day in court, have many supporters. Today, more than 100 public figures, including writer Sally Rooney and actors Zoe Wanamaker, Steve Coogan, and Brian Cox, have signed a letter of protest against what they call a potential miscarriage of justice. The letter says this: To bypass the jury and sentence a group of protesters as terrorists would constitute an extremely grave miscarriage of justice with consequences far beyond this case alone. Never before has a link to terrorism been imposed at the sentencing stage in a criminal damage case. The implications for civil liberties in Britain are difficult to overstate. The only stated basis for this connection is that the defendants were, quote, attempting to influence the Israeli government by restricting their access to weapons. This is an obvious effort to undermine solidarity with Palestine, but what it really undermines is UK law. Other letters have been submitted by legal experts, academics, former police officers, and many more. But for one of those facing prison, Leona Kamio, who goes by the name Ellie, there's been no greater defender than her mum. Earlier today, I spoke to Emma Kamio, an absolutely fierce mother doing everything she can to protect her daughter from injustice. We're going to put the full interview out separately this evening. I really recommend you watch it because she is an amazing woman and she's hilarious as well. But I wanted to play you one part where Emma recounts how she found herself arrested under the Terrorism Act. I began by asking her how Ellie was doing ahead of the sentencing.
I mean, Ellie is a strong character, incredibly resilient. She's ultimately a survivor. And I haven't spoken to her for a couple of days, but I've had feedback that she's still laughing and smiling and joking. I'm not going to lie, we are nervous about Friday because I think it's more of the unknown, even though we don't exactly know the figures. But the bottom line is that she made a stand in a genocide, so her conscience is at peace.
And do you have any sense of your expectations for Friday?
Well, I'm trying not to expect because I've been hugely disappointed many times in the last 2 years. But I think, we've got the measure of the judge. And, this is a political case. So it's not about what's right and what's wrong. It's about what's needed from a political point of view. And if we're lucky, we'll be lucky if she gets 2 years, probably 4 years, possibly 6. And I mean, it could be 10, but apparently unlikely.
There's been a number of things about this case that I imagine must have been really frustrating for you. So, for example, the fact that certain lawful excuses defences were ruled out by the judge. Certain things weren't allowed to be talked about in court. And indeed, in the first trial, one of the barristers, the barrister for Charlotte Head, there was an attempt to prosecute him for contempt of court for hinting at various things to the jury then. Another is, of course, the terror connection, which has not been reportable wasn't reportable until after the conviction. How has it been for you knowing that these things, and for Ellie, knowing these things are all there, but they're not things that the jury, when thinking about convicting, were allowed to know?
Well, from day one, it's been a roller coaster, just absorbing each piece that came through, the information. You process something and then you hit something else and you get your expectations that they, may get bail. It's just been going on for so long that it's difficult for me to answer. Look at all the attention we're getting now. It's the press of finally the reporting restrictions have been lifted and we've been able to talk about it. And I'd love to sing like a canary, but, my fight has been to cope with the next fire that's in front of me. And deal with that fire, and then the next, then the next one will come. So, whilst the rest of the world is catching up on what we've been up against, for me, it's like that's old news. I've got the next fire in front of me is her being about to be sentenced as a terrorist, and what that means. Although we have known from, I think it was March 25, we knew that she was going to be sentenced as a terrorist, or could be, or probably would be, and that is unprecedented, but that was, again, at that time, that was too far down in the future. There were so many hurdles to get across and possibilities that it might not come to that. So, it's clearly fixed and needed and been needed by the state to secure the prescription of Palestine Action, which has been for Israel's benefit. That once you've got your head around that, it's, it does feel like a massive uphill struggle, but then there's the small wins, and they've come along in each time. There's a little win, and then there's a little bit of hope. So
I wondered if you could take us back to 2024 when Ellie was arrested. How did you come to know of it? What was that like?
I was given a phone call in about midday. I think she was arrested in the early hours of the morning, And I got a phone call from somebody claiming to be an organisation called Palestine Action, which I'd never heard of, just saying that she'd been arrested. And I thought, she did tell me she was going on a protest, and I believed that, I assumed, I should say, that would be, a march in London, and she let me believe that. So it didn't really ring true. I went to work, carried on as normal, but it was 4:00 that afternoon when riot police just entered my home and arrested me. That is when it all began to kind of unfold. So many people, the film Operation Recomply, which has followed the family's story for the last 18 months, has just revealed why I was implicated. And it was just a mistake, really. She'd gone off and she'd sent me a text the night before saying that she had used my telephone number to hire a van. I didn't give it much thought. Ellie is, an adult, nearly 30 years of age. She was just being respectful. I've used your phone number, just letting you know. And that was it, really. Then I was rearrested under the Terrorism Act and got caught up in it. I disappeared for 5 days myself. These days, that's not actually really big, surprising news. In fact, being arrested under the Terrorism Act has become a bit of a badge of honour with the Defend Our Juries campaign. But at the time, I think I was one of the first white, middle-aged women in this country to be arrested under the Terrorism Act. And it was very scary for my family because I disappeared for 5 days. But in all honesty, I spent the first 3 days just jumping up and down, really cross that I run my own business. I've got 2 businesses, a small Pilates school, and I'm a homeopath. So I knew I had patients booked in and I had people turning up for classes. And I just kept thinking about the reputational damage that was going to do to my business. So I was more in, I suppose, fight mode rather than, it didn't scare me. It was probably used more, if anything, to scare Ellie because she was doing a no comment interview. But eventually I was released after 5 days, and that was the end of that, really. I never got my things back. They've got my, my laptop and my phone and my jewelry and everything else. But, at some point I had to let that go because I was making myself ill trying to get that back. You just come up against a brick wall every time. It really is quite shocking, but that'll all have to come out in a movie later on down the track.
What were the 5 days like when you were in counter-terror custody?
It's been incredible what I've learned in these last couple of years. Until that moment, I'd only ever had a couple of parking fines and a couple of speeding tickets. Never been inside a police station, but I am generally a good, upstanding citizen. I haven't had much call with the police at all. But I immediately went into meditation once they handcuffed me. No, I don't mean once they handcuffed me in the house. Once they took me into the van and drove me off, I meditated, and then I sat in Swansea police station. Then they transferred me overnight in an unmarked car to Bristol, where I started to think, quietly. I'm calm, I'm like a duck. I'm calm on the surface and paddle like hell underneath. And the entire time I was thinking, this has got to be to do with Ellie. She's gone on this protest. What the hell has happened? I was trying to figure it out. It didn't, it was a couple of days before I was in front of a magistrate who then sort of briefly top-lined what they had done, and then I had some sense of it. I always knew that it had to be something to do with my telephone number for the rental of the van. That was obvious, but I didn't actually know what they'd done or anything. So when I was rearrested under the Terrorism Act in Bristol, they transferred me to Newbury, which is like a pop-up terrorist centre. And it was after they'd arrested me under the Terrorism Act that I then become attacked prisoner. And I'm put in the back of a van with Ellie, which was odd at the time. But I think, again, that was to show her that, we've got your mother, just to get her to talk. And from the minute we left, it was, if it wasn't terrifying, it was hysterical, funny, because it was, I can remember sitting in the back of this van and the gates of the police station opened. And the minute we hit the pavement, they put on the blue sirens and the blue light and the sirens. We went through Bristol at about 4:00 in the afternoon. So we've got, school children and that kind of thing, going on. Then we hit the M4. And once we hit the M4, we were traveling like at 120 miles an hour, sirens going, no seatbelt on in the back. And my life flashed before me, and I thought, one wrong move with that driver, and my other children have lost their sister and their mother in one hit. And I had one hand bracing myself on the side panel and my foot up against the front. And I've since found out that it's because you're attacked prisoner. They have to, it's called transferring you under a code 1. And a code 1 just means that they need to go this fast in case other terrorists intercept to, it's like something out of a Netflix movie. It was ridiculous. But like I said, terrifying for my life in case there was an accident, and hysterically funny is to go, oh my God, only Ellie. She's always like the drama, but this was ridiculous.
So you were released after 5 days. So you were, and no charges were brought, presumably, right?
No,
so you were just de-arrested.
Yeah, no further action, no apologies, no belongings returned.
Yeah, that's quite some treatment for someone who did absolutely nothing.
And all the way along, as I kept going further and further away from my home up the M4, each police officer was like, I'm getting further away. How am I going to get home? I've got nothing. Oh, don't worry, we'll get you home. They bloody didn't.
Right. So you were just released from the centre, and then you had to arrange your own transport home.
Well, I was furious because they didn't ask me. Well, I never got my call. I never got to see a duty solicitor, and the way I was treated was diabolical. I didn't get a duty solicitor in Swansea. I didn't get one in Bristol. They denied it. They wouldn't admit that. They just said that she'd left. But I just know that she said she'd be there in the morning, and it's 2:00 in the afternoon when they rearrested me, and said that they were taking me to Newbury. So yeah, the way I was treated was dreadful. But when I was released, they just said, "We've rung your brother," and I was like, "What right have you got to ring my brother?" They have no idea what my relationship was like with my brother because he lived in Oxford, and my brother just dutifully came and picked me up and drove me back to Wales. But had I have been asked, I'd have said, "No, you got me here. You get me home."
That was Emma Kamio talking to me earlier today, and I was corrected by the producer Alex while that was playing, because I'd said that it will come out later tonight. Actually, it's going to come out tomorrow, so look out for it then. It's a really great interview. It's really interesting, Aaron. It's like Emma is the second mum of one of the Filton 6 that I've met. I've also met Zoe Rogers' mum, Claire, and interviewed her at a protest a while back, and they strike me. I don't know about Claire, but Emma was telling me, really not really political, never had any trouble with police, but sort of become radicalized by the process that their kids have gone through. Yeah. And what is so clearly, as many people said in this letter today, as many people with eyes can see, is a kind of profound stitch up, or let's say a miscarriage of justice, potentially a misuse of the justice system, especially with the idea that this. The direct action that took place was about influencing the government of Israel, its policy. Like, I don't think any of these people think they can influence Benjamin Netanyahu, right? But what I wanted to ask you is, you've got a daughter, I've got a daughter. Is there anything that you wouldn't do for her if she ended up in a situation like this?
No.
Right.
No. You would always, you go to hell and back for them, wouldn't you? And I suppose, even if you don't agree with the grievance that they're campaigning or focused on, seeing them mistreated by the police and the criminal justice system, I mean, like you said, radicalizing. I think most people, most of the time, think the police are just trying to do a job. They're not malicious. They don't always get it right, of course, but, they're there to uphold the rule of law, keep the peace. That is not what Palestine Action and its treatment by the state has looked like. I mean, it's really an extraordinary episode in the recent history of this country in terms of political campaigning, freedom of speech, and so on. And I think the exceptional nature of that has really radicalized lots of people and will continue to do so. And it's one of the reasons why I'm at a loss as to the Home Secretary and the PM carrying on with this. I can see why they did it initially. There was bad legislation made in 2000 with the Terrorism Act.
Well, it's 2021 that brings in this idea that you can apply a terror connection to sort of smaller crimes like criminal damage.
Yeah. So, I get that, but at a certain point you must think, crikey, hold on, we're looking up thousands of people for basically nothing. Yeah, they've got friends and family members. We're discrediting the system, and I said earlier, the state, in the eyes of many, many people who otherwise just wouldn't even think about it. I must say this as well, Stephen. I think I left you a voice note, was it last week?
I can't remember.
Because somebody came up to me in a pub
I remember, yeah.
in South London, and they'd been arrested on a Palestine Action. And they said, I just want to say Novara's covered this so well. And I said, don't tell me, tell Stephen. He's the person who's driven most of it, not all of it. Harriet as well has done great work. All the people here, of course. Alex as well has been a major player in it. But I said, send Stephen a message. He's on holiday, but I'm sure he won't mind hearing your voice. And she did. And it's true. The coverage at Novara Media of Palestine Action and this remarkable story in recent British political history is, I think, unparalleled.
Yeah, it was a very moving message to get from somebody who had also been their father had been arrested at one of the protests, right? One of the Defend Our Juries protests, and they were very happy about our coverage of it. I think, on our coverage of Palestine Action, I feel really, really proud to have been able to do it, and actually, frankly, honoured to have been able to sort of speak to and meet so many of the people involved. And I think, as an organisation, we should be incredibly proud of not only the fact that we've made, I think, at many points, sort of historical journalistic interventions into, material reality and material politics, sort of writing to the Attorney General to get guidance on the prescription, like, intervening in the prescription case, always working within the law, but being very careful about what we put out, but putting out as much as we could. I think we should be very proud of that, and I think we also have like a really historic archive of material for recording what, as you say, is a truly historic moment in a kind of the state and the judiciary turning on its own citizens for what looks like another state.
Well, it looks like that. I think it is that. I mean, who knows? Also, when you're younger, you think that there are people in charge. But on this story, nobody knew what the hell was going on, from the Daily Mirror to the Daily Mail to the Guardian. Nobody in the media game really thought, I know how we can cover this without breaking the law. Basically nobody, and that included us. And I think, again, to commend you, we helped probe where that line was, and we ultimately got there, and it helped our coverage, I think. And it also gave the public a better understanding of what was at stake. Because, of course, if people don't know where the red lines are and they don't probe and they don't push, you don't get the story. People don't know what's going on. And journalism doesn't work.
Yeah, that's very true. And it's very important that journalism does work. I was going to plug that interview with Emma Kamio one more time. It's so rich. It's so interesting. I think you'll love it. Please look out for it later. In the meantime, thank you, Aaron, so much for joining me tonight.
My pleasure. I was about to call you Michael.
Oh.
I saw a comment saying...
I have a lot of thoughts about that.
I saw one of the comments saying, where's Michael? He's coming back. He's on holiday, don't worry. We also go on holiday here at Novara Media. It's been great talking to you tonight, Stephen. And somebody also said yesterday, where are the Novara Media football shirts? They've sold out. We'll do a second round. Don't worry.
And thank you, everyone, for tuning in. Come back tomorrow for another live stream from 6 p.m. For now, you've been watching Novara Media. Good night.